It is an extraordinary honor and a privilege to get to sit down with someone who's both a teacher and a friend.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah. You know, there are so many people who are going to be watching this and listening to you who have read your books and have benefited from your scholarship. But I think we want to have a sense of the insan that animates that scholarship. So if it's all right with you, I thought we would just take a journey through the years. And,
why not?
We can start a little bit ahead of the Ahd al-Ast. Because if we go back that far, then
we would never reach our goal.
Our goal, right? So how about if we start with childhood? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Los Angeles. I was a child when we lived in a house on the west side of Los Angeles in what is now a very fancy area called Brentwood, but then was a rather simple place, and I saw the 405 freeway being built. And in those days, the pollution in Los Angeles was very noticeable. But I had a very wonderful childhood. One brother, one sister, and my parents were wonderful people. So I have moments that I can recall from those early days of seeing the sunlight refracted through the trees around where we lived. Sense of beauty. It made me think that because of those sun rays, this is why people invented pillars, to try to show the equivalent of the heavens in their houses. So, and then when I was about 8 years old, we moved to Denver, Colorado, and again, I had a really great childhood growing up in that area. To ski and enjoy the woods, and I was in the Boy Scouts, and lots of adventures like that. The event which perhaps made the biggest impact on me growing up was when I was informed that I had been selected for an exchange student position in the American Field Service. And I remember thinking that I wanted to graduate with my class and not miss the final end of high school. And so you could choose either the northern or the southern hemisphere, but the schedule was 6 months different. And so I said southern hemisphere, and so that meant I left in January, February, and spent the calendar year in Chile. And it was an extraordinary experience because I was in a town where I was one of the only people who spoke English. And so I had to learn Spanish very fast. And I attended a school where I was thrown into this boys' school, the Liceo de Hombres. And the president of the student body was a Marxist. And this was during the Vietnam War. And I got a lot of questions from people about why America was in the Vietnam War business. And I began to see very quickly that I did not know very much about this world outside of the United States. And that made a profound impact upon me. Because for whatever other virtues Americans have, knowledge about the rest of the world is not one of them. Yeah. So this sort of drew me eventually into thinking about how we could improve that, how we could change that, and make Americans more aware of the complexity of the world. So that experience was truly great, and I came back very fluent in Spanish as well. So languages started to have an importance for me at that time.
Now, was that the first language outside of English that you really invested in?
Well, I spent 2 years studying German in high school, but the intensity of the high school language instruction is not particularly great. So, but being dropped into an environment where you're living with a family and you find yourself in a fog for 2 or 3 months, but then things just magically open up, at least when you're 16 years old.
Right, right. It slows down a little bit sometimes.
Yes.
Later on. Yes. Yeah. And was there, in terms of your upbringing, the decision to have you go to Chile, that must say something about your family background and their openness to something like this.
Yes, I think in particular my mother was always committed to culture and literature, and she had done some graduate work in English literature at Stanford after World War II. She joined the Navy, and my parents met during the war, and she was a paymaster, and my father met her on the ship, and they got together eventually. But she was always tremendously encouraging of these intellectual enterprises, and so it was with their support that I did that. And since my father had attended Stanford as an undergraduate, it sort of was predetermined that I would go to Stanford, which is a good school as
fine university. Yeah. Do you remember when you entered the university? Did you have a particular trajectory or career in mind, or was it just with a wide sense of openness of where it could lead to?
Well, I was actually focusing on mathematics, and I had done very well on the exams and so forth. And I took an advanced freshman seminar in mathematics to begin with, which was really quite interesting. But I began to feel that I ended up deciding that the verbal, the literary, the textual is where I wanted to be. The sciences ultimately were not where I found myself most comfortable. But I have some interesting memories going back about looking at texts. Once when I was young, I was reading, I think it was Hans Brinker and the Silver Skates. And I was reading a page, and I got to a line, and the next line didn't make any sense. And I puzzled over it for what seemed like the longest time. And I realized that one of the lines was out of place. And if it was restored to its proper position, one could read the story clearly, and I was very happy with that. But I didn't realize that it was this problem-solving of the text that I was discovering at that moment.
Do you remember if there were courses that you took at the university that continued to expand your interest in languages, cultures, religious traditions?
Yes, I discovered there was a program at Stanford called the Humanities Honors Program. And when I made the decision to move away from mathematics, I also took a class on Islamic studies from a professor named Lawrence Berman, who was really a fine scholar who specialized in the philosophy, Ibn Rushd, Maimonides, and other figures like that. And he was very fluent in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic. And he was really a fine scholar and a gentleman. And I had the opportunity to work with him and with other people. And the basic course survey in humanities was really inspiring because it was taught by gifted people to a large group of students. But for instance, when we got to Dante, I just immersed myself in this, and it was really a tremendous experience. And I had another textual experience when we were reading the classical period. And we had an exam where I remember taking it to, we could take our exams to the coffee house and do them wherever we wanted in those days. And so there was a passage in the Iliad that I remembered when there was a question about Virgil's Aeneid, where there's a description of the passion of Aeneas, the hero, for Queen Dido. And I realized that it used exactly the same metaphors that Homer had used to describe the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus. And the notion of these textual interconnections, it suddenly hit me. So that was the beginning of my exploration of the humanities in that fashion. And it was exciting.
Mm-hmm. I think the early interest and training that you had in philosophy, that makes a lot of sense, because among many other gifts and talents, I think one of the things that for many of us always characterizes your scholarship is that you're one of the very few people that has this extraordinary combination of rigor and methodical thoroughness on one hand, and zauq and kashf on the other. And it's rare to see those two come together in the same person. Sometimes, you see people who are given over to such flowery language and metaphors piled on top of one another that it comes at the expense of the rigor of their thought. And then sometimes with other people, perhaps the Aristotelian training has been sapping away something of their soul a little too much.
Well, thank you for saying that. I feel like I had the opportunity to work with people who permitted me to have that appreciation, and people who love literature so intensely. So I've learned from my elders in that respect.
As you were going through the career at Stanford, was it always clear to you that graduate school would be what would come next?
I was not clear about that, in part because I wasn't sure. I was concerned that I might become overly absorbed in these intellectual activities to the extent of occluding the realities that are there behind us in the spirit and in the higher realms. So I was a little unsure about that, but people kept telling me that I should do that, and to be honest, I didn't have too many other choices in front of me professionally that I was drawn towards. The only other option as a professional path that I might have taken was to continue being a waiter, which I was doing for quite some time.
Was there a connection between being a waiter and your interests in these fields?
Well, after I graduated from Stanford, and after doing some traveling in India and other things, I found myself in Portland, Oregon. And one of my very good friends had persuaded me that what we needed to do was to learn Persian, because then we could read Hafez and Rumi in the original language. And we started, and Persian is a language you can actually start on your own. It's not as grammatically complicated as Arabic. And then we found a teacher at Portland State University who was offering classes in Persian. He was an American who was married to an Iranian. And so we showed up and said, we want to read Hafez and Rumi. He was kind of amazed. But we did. And it was difficult. But it was a unforgettable experience, and I still remember with precise details the poems, and 50 poems of Hafiz that Arbery published many years ago. And I remember many of the lines. And Nicholson's selections from the Diwani Shamsi Tabriz,
1898,
which includes some not so verses, but which are nevertheless quite good.
Yeah.
So during that time, I was working as a waiter in a Chinese restaurant. This might seem a little bit unlikely. The name of the restaurant was Double Happiness, which might have been a good omen, but it was far from my apartment, so I would have to work at lunch and dinner, and I would stay at the restaurant in between, and I had my Persian dictionary and Golestan and the grammar, and I would sit there in the restaurant in between lunch and dinner working on this. And finally I said to myself, there must be a better way to do this. And so I went to talk to the professor, and he said, yes, it's called graduate school. And he said, you should go study with Anna Marie Schimmel. He himself, his name was John Lorenz, and he ended up teaching in Ohio. And I haven't been in touch with him in some time, but we had a long-standing relationship. He was a PhD from Princeton.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's when I made the decision to go to graduate school. And so I applied to Harvard, and I think hardly any place else. Oh, and by the way, I also had someone encouraging me in some very important ways from my family, who was Professor L. Carl Brown, who for many years taught at Princeton University and was a very fine Arabic scholar. And he used to joke that there was a gene in our family which was located in the waters of Murray County, Kentucky, that had something to do with the study of Arabic in the Middle East. And he gave me some very important advice when I started graduate school. He said, finish as quickly as possible and save your best ideas for later.
I think I've heard versions of that same advice coming from you, that the dissertation should not be your masterpiece. Yeah?
No, it's simply a demonstration.
Competency demonstration.
A demonstration of the achievement of original research.
That's right.
It's not the last thing you're going to say. So that's what made me decide to go to Harvard.